Hi, it's Brad Truax from Eastman Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. We're here to talk a little bit about forest basics today. We're blessed with multiple forests here at Eastman, and understanding a few basics hopefully will help you fully appreciate and enjoy this incredible asset that we have here at Eastman. The forest is not just a bunch of trees. It's a complex, living, breathing entity full of both plant and animal. There are complex interactions between virtually everything in the forest. And we need to preserve our forests, not just for the beauty that they provide, but also because they're critical for our own survival. So let's explore the forest and begin with the basics. There are multiple layers to the forest. Seven are usually recognized. There's an overstory, there's an understory, a shrub layer, an herbaceous layer, a root layer, a ground cover layer, and a vine layer. And every one of these is important. Now, you don't even have to go out to the forest to recognize these layers. Most of you who live here at Eastman are surrounded by trees. So if you go out and take a look, you'll probably see an overstory where you have a canopy of trees, then an understory where some shorter trees are located, and then you have some shrubs. Below the shrubs, you have various herbs and so on. Then you have a ground layer with grasses and probably a few weeds. And then you may have some vines growing up around your trees. Some people will further separate the upper layers, the overstory layer, into both an emergent layer and a canopy. Now, if you're driving down Route 89 and you look out into the forest, sometimes you will see a few trees that seem to be sticking up out above all the other trees. And that's what we mean by the emergent layer. And then there's the hidden layer that's underneath. There's a vast underground biological network made up of mycorrhizal fungi. The fungi grow on the tips of the tree roots, and they provide the tree roots with nutrients and water in exchange for photosynthetic energy. And these fungi link the trees, whether of the same or different species, in this vast mycelial lattice. The trees actually are communicating with each other via this network. And if you lose what's called the mother tree, it can have devastating effects on the surrounding trees, not only of the same species, but of multiple species. And this work comes from Suzanne Simard, who's authored a great book called The Mother Tree, which we highly recommend that you read. Just a little reminder about chemistry and physiology. Trees and plants use carbon, water, and oxygen, along with micronutrients, chlorophyll, and sunshine, to be able to create carbohydrates and energy. And during the daytime, trees and most plants breathe in carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. Pretty good for us, huh? And at night, they breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide, just like we do. And by utilizing carbon dioxide and other carbon sources, they can help reduce the greenhouse gases that are leading to global warming and climate change. Sunlight in the forest is important. Trees and plants need sunlight, both sunlight, water, and nutrients. And some need more sunlight than others. Those that need lots of sunlight have to grow tall. And on the other hand, there's some shade tolerant plants that can grow in the understory or some of the lower layers. Eastern hemlock and sugar maples are examples of shade tolerant trees that can grow underneath the canopy. On the other hand, aspen is a shade intolerant tree that needs to grow where there's lots of sunlight. So these often grow in wetlands or along waterways. By the way, that's probably a reason aspens are a favorite food of beavers. When you're out walking in the forest, you may see some tree stumps. And again, there are three types of stumps. The conifers tend to rot from the outside in. Harder trees tend to rot in a more uniform manner. And real hardwoods like oak tend to hollow from inside outward. And sometimes trees may grow on a stump. Hemlocks may grow, for instance, on a white pine stump. And some animals prefer to defecate on these tree stumps, particularly weasels. Okay. So some animals were using this tree stump as a latrine. Foxes, weasels, mink, and raccoons often defecate on top of tree stumps. And it looks like in this case, it was coyotes or bobcats that decided to make this tree stump a nice latrine. Here's an example of new trees that are growing up on a tree stump. The nutrients in the decaying stump can actually feed new growth. So basically, there's life after death. The dying tree led to new life for a new tree. Nurse logs are actually very interesting. Sometimes new trees will grow up right through a fallen tree, and such fallen trees are called nurse logs. Here you can see a fallen tree that's decaying, and these other trees actually grew up right through it. So that's a classic nurse log. This is showing the types of rot, rotting from the inside, heart rot, rotting from the outside. One of the key things when you're in the forest, you may look at the ground and notice that it's irregular. We're not talking, when we talk about pillows and cradles, we're not talking about sleeping in the forest. Scattered throughout most forests are mounds and depressions. And these are remnants of old uprooted trees. The pattern of pillows and cradles can tell us a lot about what caused the uprooting. So, for example, if the pillows and cradles in an area are all aligned in the same direction, it would be likely that either a windstorm or a hurricane caused the felling of those trees several years back. And on the other hand, if the pillows and cradles point in many directions, the event that caused it might have been an ice storm. And if there are no pillows and cradles, it's likely that that was once a field that had actually been plowed. This is a picture of this scene 20 years from now. Again, here's a root ball from a fallen tree. Okay, here's the space that's left from where the root ball used to be. So as this decays, what you're going to see is this will turn into a mound or a pillow, and this will exist as a depression, which we call a cradle. So the spot where the root ball is will become the pillow, the depression will become the cradle. And this is showing pillows and cradles. Here, what you can see is this tree in the center is actually growing up on a pillow where an uprooted root ball used to be. And below it is a depression that's called the cradle. You may occasionally see what are called basal scars when you're out in the forest. And basal scars are where the bark was lost due to either fire or a collision when logging was happening. You'd expect that those due to fire would be on the downhill side because fire moves uphill when there's a wildfire. But in fact, it's actually the opposite. Most of these basal scars are on the uphill side. And that's because there are what we call fuel pockets. That's where dead leaves and sticks have fallen down due to gravity and accumulate on the uphill side of the tree. And then when there's a fire, the fire is much more intense on that side. Occasionally, you may see a pine that's forked. White pines usually grow very straight up, but in this case, you see a pine that now is bifurcated. And when you see that, it usually indicates that this pine was infected by a pine weevil at less than age 15. Snags are important. Snags are dead trees that are left standing in the forest. That's an example of a snag. They make up as much as 10 to 20% of all trees in some old growth or tropical or temperate or even boreal forests. And they support a rich community of decomposers like bacteria, fungi, insects, and other invertebrates. And the cavities and hollows that you see in some of these snags are important habitat for birds, bats, small mammals, and all of those in turn feed upon or may be fed by larger mammalian predators. And owls get a great view from some of these snags. So what happens when a tree falls in the forest? Fallen trees help sustain life around them. First of all, they might create some space and let more sunlight fall in so that the other plants and trees can flourish. But they also decompose and their contents get converted to carbon dioxide and water, and the remaining nutrients are simply released into the soil. Fungi spur decomposition, and these are aided by bacteria and some invertebrates such as slugs and beetles and millipedes, and mold will also come in. And the term detrivore is used to refer to these organisms that feed on the decaying organic matter. And as they feed on the wood, they open it up to moisture, which further speeds up the decomposition process. Hollow logs can provide shelter for many different species, and often rotten wood starts mixing with the soil, and then earthworms show up to start feasting on it. And animals eat the organisms that are eating the woods, then they get eaten by other animals, and so on and on and on. So life springs up from these fallen trees, and that's why we leave them in the forest unless they're blocking our trails or otherwise a hazard to people. Slash basically is woody material that's left behind after trees are harvested or pruned or thinned in a forest. And it's made up of bits of branches and bark, as well as small offcuts and wood chips that are left over. And slash can be a hazard for wildfires, but slash can also be useful. It contains carbon and many micronutrients like nitrogen, magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium. And these contribute to the organic material that's cycling, and they release these macronutrients into the soil. So these contribute to the organic flora of the forest, and it can slash can also provide shade and shelter for some birds and other wildlife. And much of the microorganism community, basically insects, fungi, small reptiles and amphibians, even small mammals, depend on the habitats actually created by slash. So we usually recommend leaving slash where it is in the forest, but not piling it up too high as to become a fire hazard. Another concept is forest succession. Forests are dynamic, they're always changing. Even old growth forests, like those that we have here at Eastman, are continually changing. And in response to some events like fire or hurricane, ice storm, windstorm, logging, etc., forests go through a series of changes. And there are basically 5 stages of forest succession that are generally recognized. First is nudation, second, invasion, third is competition or coaction, fourth is reaction, and the fifth is climax or stabilization. And different wildlife species may benefit from each stage. There are 2 types of forest succession that are recognized. Primary succession is where there was land that did not previously have plants. This might be a glacier retreating or a new sandbar in a river. On the other hand, secondary succession is what occurs when there's a disturbance on previously vegetated lands, such as a fire or an ice storm. And the first requirement for a forest is having nitrogen in the soil. And in primary succession, nitrogen is actually removed from the air in a stage called a pre-forest. In secondary succession, the nitrogen is already in the soil from the previous plants and trees that have decayed there. This is showing secondary succession. So here you have a fire, goes through a period of nudation where there's basically nothing there. Then annual plants start to grow. At 3 to 4 years, you start to get some grasses and some perennials. After about 5 years, you start to get some shrubs, small pines, young oak, young hickory trees. And then finally, after many years, here it says 150 years, but it's probably much less than that, you have the climax where you have a mature forest. This one is showing primary succession, where at the beginning, on these rocks and areas that did not have vegetation, all of a sudden you have some lichen and some mosses that are pioneer species. Shortly after that, you'll start to get some grasses, herbs, some small shrubs, and some tree seedlings. And then after that, you'll start to get some trees that require a lot of sunlight, like aspen. And then finally, you'll get in the climax community, you get the tall trees, including white pines and a number of hardwood trees in the mature forest. And again, in the early succession, you get grasses and non-wooding plants. These are called pioneer species. Bushes and raspberries, such as raspberry, come next. After that, you get species that do well in the sun, such as ash, cherry trees. They're the first trees that recolonize an area. And as those trees mature, they start to shade the forest floor. So you get some shade loving species like the maple that appear next. And then over time, the older sun loving trees die out and the shade tolerant species take over. So again, it's not just the plants that evolve during a forest succession. There's an abundance, the abundance and kinds of wildlife also change as the forest matures because the quantity and the quality of food, water, cover, and space are constantly changing. So young forests have an abundance of berry-producing shrubs and brushy cover, and very few hard masts such as acorns and hickories or cavity trees are available then. So later on, it's squirrels or nesting species like woodpeckers that are much more abundant in the older forests as opposed to the younger forests. And white-tailed deer use several stages of plant succession. Deer need the cover that's provided by thickets and shrubs and saplings and plants that are at a level that they can reach for feeding. But they also feed extensively on the acorns that are found under the trees in a mature forest, and they will seek out some of the succulent vegetation and grains that occur in agricultural fields as well. Most New England forests are what we call mixed conifer deciduous forests. And again, in the forest succession, they get grasses, sedge, and bushes in stage 1 through 3. Then tree seedlings rise above those shrubs. The white pine tends to be the fastest and growing and dominates the canopy in stage 4. But because they block sunlight and use much of the water in the soil, white pine seedlings then have difficulty growing in their shade. So some of the shade tolerant hardwood species begin to grow in stage 5. And as the white pines die, the hardwoods tend to grow higher and wider. This is stage 6. And finally, because most of the hardwood species are able to regenerate in their own shade, the forest continues to mature and reaches stage 7 and stays there until the next disturbance occurs. Now, not only does the forest have a succession, but beaver ponds also have a succession. They're dynamic areas that produce a series of habitat types as they age. When they're abandoned, they turn into beaver meadows. And you can see a beaver meadow from the wetland spur off the Springbrook Trail here at Eastman. And beaver meadows are ideal areas for grouse to rear their broods. Deer and other animals use these areas in the summer because of the edge, which is created between the woods and the meadow. This is what a beaver meadow looks like. When the beavers abandon the pond, a new dynamic occurs. As the water drains, much sediment is left, and sedge or grass-covered field is created, and that's called the beaver meadow. Wildflowers will pop up, other diverse plants will pop up amongst the grasses, and many snags remain. And all these lead to habitat that's very desirable to a number of wildlife species. New Hampshire is 84% forested. I believe that New Hampshire is either the second or third most forested state in the country, behind Maine and perhaps Oregon. And most of the forest in New Hampshire is actually privately owned. And climate, elevation, soil conditions, and land use history all play a role in determining which type of forest will grow in a particular area. And in turn, the forest type influences the variety of wildlife that will be inhabiting an area. And there are basically 5 forest types that are recognized in New Hampshire: white pine, northern hardwood, spruce fir, red oak, hemlock, and probably also a 6th, aspen birch. And Eastman's forests are up to 80 years old, so they're mostly mature forests. And they're mixed types with lots of maple, white pine, spruce, beech, and northern hardwoods mixed in with some hemlock. A keystone species is important. A keystone is a wedge-shaped block that holds up an arch. And if you remove that keystone, the entire structure crumbles. So changes to a keystone species would affect a broader ecology. And examples of biological keystones are beavers almost anywhere, salmon in Alaska, elephants in the savanna, and wolves in Yellowstone Park. So is the oak a keystone species? Well, the oak certainly is a keystone species. And that means that they're critical for the ecology of the forest. An oak tree can live for hundreds of years and produce about 3 million acorns over that lifetime. And that provides essential food for dozens of bird species like jays, woodpeckers, turkeys, also for birds, deer, raccoons, possums, rodents like squirrels and mice, and even insects like weevils. The leaves of the oak also feed caterpillars of over 500 species of moths and butterflies. And caterpillars, in turn, contain protein and lipids that are critical food for birds that have to feed their young to grow and develop. And oaks are also important, obviously, for building ships, homes, and furniture. A little different from from a keystone species, is a foundation species. And basically, a foundation species is one that creates a stable conditions for other species by modulating a number of factors in the ecosystem. An example, which we can see here at Eastman, is the eastern hemlock forest. Eastern hemlock is one of the most long-lived and shade-tolerant trees in North America. And in hemlock-dominated stands, the combination of deep shade and acidic, slowly decomposing litter results in a cool, damp microclimate, which is ideal for several other plants to grow. So these characteristics of the hemlock, along with its ability to intercept falling snow, tends to mediate moisture levels in the soil. It stabilizes base flows in streams and decreases the variation that occurs in stream temperatures. As a result, streams that flow through the hemlock forests have a unique assemblage of salamanders, fish, and freshwater invertebrates that are intolerant to seasonal drying that might otherwise occur. And hemlock stands also shelter deer and other wildlife. You can see a rich hemlock forest here in Eastman off Catamount Drive. Plants don't live in a vacuum. There's a complex interaction between flora and fauna. The trees and vegetation of the forest serve as a habitat for multiple animal species. In turn, insects and multiple types of wildlife tend to modify the forest. There's a phenomenon called coevolution. There are unique relationships that occur between insects and native plants that have evolved over a long time. So they're tied together from an evolutionary standpoint. In fact, up to 90% of all species of insect herbivores can successfully reproduce only on plant lineages from which they shared an evolutionary history. And there's specialized relationship between plants and animals, which are actually the rule rather than the exception in nature. So they're actually far more common than generalized relationships. One example might be milkweed and monarch butterflies. But predators also co-evolve with plants and control spread. And that's important because if a plant is introduced to a new area that lacks those insect predators, that plant often becomes invasive and will outgrow native plants in the area. There's a phenomenon called the trophic cascade. Let me describe that. An acorn grows into an oak tree. The oak tree then sheds acorns. An acorn weevil may find an acorn on the ground. It drills a hole in the acorn and removes the insides. Well, acorn ants then move into the hollow acorn and begin to propagate. And those acorn ants then will live aside aphids on plants. And the aphids feed on the sap of plants and secrete a liquid known as honeydew. The ants are drawn to that sugar rich substance and they harvest it as a food source. And in return, the ants protect the aphids from predators like ladybugs. And ultimately, the harvester butterfly may then feed on the aphids. So this is showing an incredible cascade where that simple acorn led to all these consequences. The best example of the trophic cascade was described by Aldo Leopold, the famous naturalist, ecologist, and conservationist. And he basically talked about what happens when you remove alpha predators from an ecology. And you can see this. I'd highly recommend all of you, if you haven't seen it already, go to this website to see how wolves change the rivers. It's all about Yellowstone. And at one time, all the wolves were removed from Yellowstone. Wolves are an alpha predator, and that removal led to widespread long-term implications. But then when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995, a whole host of changes took place. The wolves began to cull the deer and elk populations that had been eating foliage, particularly young willow, aspen, and cottonwood, that the beavers need. So now the deer and the elk began to avoid going to the valleys because of fear of the wolves. So the foliage started to regenerate, forests appeared, willows reappeared, and then songbirds and beavers reappeared. And of course, the beavers built dams and created ponds that led to benefit of multiple species. And the wolves also killed the coyotes, so many of the small mammals started to flourish. And bears and eagles started to feed on the carrion that was left by the wolves. They could also eat the more berries that were there. And the river actually changed because there was less erosion and the banks became more stable. So again, I highly recommend that if you haven't seen it, you go to that website to see this in full. You may hear the term hard mast. Hard mast consists of nuts like acorns, beech nuts, and hickory nuts. And hard mast provides crucial nourishment for many different wildlife species. Hard mast is most available in the fall, so many animals and birds need it to increase their energy reserves in preparation for the winter. And the cyclic nature of hard mast plays a key role in determining wildlife populations. Acorn production varies from year to year, kind of a boom and bust cycle. Oak trees produce acorns roughly 4 out of every 5 years. Actually, red oaks produce acorns every other year. And it takes 2 years for these nuts to mature. And it leads to big acorn crops about every 4 to 10 years. And some view this cyclical nature as an evolutionary asset. And let me explain this. The trees, like oaks, are thought to deliberately initiate these cycles to thwart what we call seed predators and ensure that a few of their offspring survive. So when they produce very few acorns, the population of squirrels, mice, etc., is going to drop off the next year. So the next year, the trees provide many acorns, and because there are fewer animals around to eat them, it's likely that some of the new seedlings will be planted. And again, that boom and bust cycles are felt throughout the wildlife community. When the oaks are producing few acorns, the population of squirrels, mice, voles, and other small animals is going to be smaller the next year. But other animals, like the red fox and owls, rely on those smaller animals as food sources. So they're going to drop off as well. And during a boom year, when there's going to be more mice and squirrels following a boom year, there's going to be an increase in the raptors and other predators of the smaller animals. So a boom year has consequences for humans too. After a boom year, the white-footed mouse will increase in number, and that means the tick population will also increase in number. And more ticks means more ticks carrying Lyme disease, which means there's going to be an increase in Lyme disease in humans. And we're often asked, this year has been incredible. There are pine cones all over the place. Look at all these pine cones on this driveway. It's been a bumper crop of pine cones in New Hampshire this year. And our white pines also have what are mast years, again, years in which the trees are producing a large number of cones. And these occur every few years. 2023 was likely a mast year for the pines. So actually, all those pine cones you're seeing are female pine cones. They're the ones that produce the seeds. Male cones are the yellowish in color. They're much smaller. They grow in spike-like clusters that produce the pollen, and they fall off the trees after pollination, usually in late May or early June, when we're seeing lots of green pollen covering virtually everything. And squirrels and some birds feed on the pine cones. There are several possible reasons have been noted for the pine cones in New Hampshire this year. One is that it's likely that 2023 was a mast year for the pine cones, but some of the ecological experts also say that the hot and dry weather conditions that occurred in 2022 stressed the white pines and caused them to increase their pine cone production in 2023. And then there's also a theory called the insect defense theory that says that as a way of avoiding insect predators, white pines will produce cones in an erratic, unpredictable fashion, so the insects can't adjust to them. Lastly, wetlands are important. A wetland is defined as a distinct ecosystem that's flooded or saturated by water, either permanently for several years or decades, or seasonally for shorter periods. And wetlands are amongst the most biologically diverse of all ecosystems, and they serve as a home to a wide range of plant and animal species. And there are multiple benefits to the wetlands. This slide shows a few of them. Again, they improve the biodiversity of a region. Roughly 40% of all the species in the world live or breed in wetlands. So it's important that we don't destroy our wetlands and we restore them where possible. Wetlands also replenish and filter our water supply. Wetlands are very good at filtering water. And wetlands, for instance, those created by a beaver pond, the weight of the water will actually push water down into the aquifers, which are extremely important for the water supply that we use for drinking. The wetlands also store carbon. Wetlands will also blunt the impact of a flood or a storm. And they have other things that they do for people who live around wetlands. So Eastman's wetlands are really underutilized jewels. We have two wetlands. The first most well-known wetland lies between Johns Glen and Heath Forest, and it's fed by Bog Brook and Eastman Brook, and it's molded by the beaver dams that are there. The less known wetland lies off the wetland spur off Springbrook Trail on the north side of Eastman, and it's really now a beaver meadow rather than the type of wetland that we have to the south. And both of these are vastly underutilized. Both of them could benefit from having an elevated platform or walkway so that we could do bird watching or wildlife viewing there. And the southern wetland could also benefit from having a kayak access. Some people do access it from off Route 114, put a kayak in there and go north, but they can't go past the beaver dams. So why aren't we using them? This is showing the wetland off Heath Forest. This is off the Yellow Trail. You can see evidence of beaver activity here. The beavers have obviously taken down these trees. These smaller trees are a favorite. The 3-inch diameter trees are a favorite of the beavers. They particularly cache those and put them underwater at their lodge so they can eat in the winter. And then I call this a beaver sculpture. It's incredible. Actually, this one was probably when there was a lot of snow here. The beaver was able to stand up on the snow and gnaw at this one. So again, there are at least 3 beaver dams in Eastman's wetlands. One is off the Yellow Trail in Heath Forest. This is the one that you'll see when you're hiking along the Yellow Trail. And if you follow Heath Forest to where the bench sits, and you look upstream in Bog Brook, you can see a second beaver dam. And then there's at least one other one that's upstream in Bog Brook. The other thing, our woodlands and wetlands and other environment are just teeming with wildlife, but we often don't see some of that wildlife. Some animals and birds are nocturnal, where they simply avoid humans. So how do we know that they're there? And we know that they're there by the signs that they leave. So we refer to those clues to their presence as collectively as sign. So what are some examples of sign? Well, obviously animal tracks like footprints and track patterns, scat that the animals leave, pellets of undigested food that might be left by, for instance, an owl, tree markings that may be left by deer or bear rubbing up against a tree, or tree markings, tree denudation that may occur from porcupines, rubs, scent markings, broken twigs or bushes that may indicate a deer had been there, bones or remains of carcasses, feathers, tunnels, caves, or burrows, and depressions in the snow where an animal may have laid down, or spike-like trunks that the beavers left, which we just showed you, and of course, sounds in the forest. So as you walk through the forest, don't forget to look up or down. You might see a bird's nest or pileated woodpecker holes in a tree, or you might see a salamander under a rock on the ground. And don't just look for plants and wildlife. You may see things of geological or historical significance, like glacial erratics, old stone walls, or cellar holes. The glacial erratic is a rock fragment that was carried by glacial ice as it moved or retreated, and it's often different from the rock that's typical of a region. This rock to the right is one of many that you may see on the Beaver Fells Trail here at Eastman. And there are certain threats to our forests. There are invasive insects like the emerald ash borer or the hemlock woolly adelgid. There are fungal diseases like beech bark disease and beech leaf disease. There are invasive plants, Phragmites, glossy buckthorn, autumn olive, Japanese knotweed, to name just a few. And climate change is a threat to our forest. Climate change has led to wildfires, more ice storms, more hurricanes. And again, another threat to the forest is development by humans. So invasives can devastate trees. Entire species can be wiped out by specific invasives. Dutch elm disease back in the 1980s killed 75% of over 77 million elm trees in the US. American chestnut blight wiped out 4 billion chestnut trees. And the emerald ash borer has put 8 billion ash trees at risk. So if you want to learn more about the forest and what you can see, I recommend a couple things by Tom Wessels. One is a book called Forest Forensics, a field guide to reading the forested landscape. And Tom Wessels has also done several YouTube videos on reading the forested landscape. These are very useful resources, and we recommend that you go to them. So again, Eastman's woods and forests are incredible resources. We hope that you'll begin to enjoy them and go out and really enjoy. So again, that's all that we have today. Once again, this is Brad Truax from Eastman Woodlands and Wildlife. Hope that you learned something this morning.